Lesson 12, adding visual effects. So in here we're going to work with some of the fixed effects. We're going to really go in and kind of see what's available inside of the effects, get a little bit more of an understanding as to what are the different effects and what do the little symbols that are inside of there, what are they indicating to you as you go in to use them. We'll apply effects, we'll remove some effects. We'll start looking at some presets. Now the nice thing is we start going with presets. If there are presets that deal with anything related to motion, know that as we go in to add those based upon where the playhead's at is where we're going to begin inserting those keyframes at. So if you've worked in After Effects, and it's the same concept as we go through and start to add items into there. Mask and track visual effects. We'll look at some keyframing. We'll go into whatever we have as frequently used ones. So when you start thinking about color corrections and things like that, they're in there. Blurs are in there. Things that you're going to use regularly. We'll talk about going in and even making your own folder, or bin in this case, of effects. If there are certain ones that you use over and over and over again, feel free to go in there and just create yourself a folder so you don't have to go in and search for them constantly and open those up. Especially, like I said, ones that you use regular. There are VR video effects inside of here too, so when we start looking at virtual reality, if you've worked with 3D, or not 3D, 360 video, there's capabilities inside of here to go in and do that as well. So for headsets and that, like we have an Oculus inside of there, and then we also have an Oculus Quest. That's the one that isn't tethered to anything as well. And then ultimately, we can go through and we can also render out the effects as well. So if you open up lesson 12, you're going to see something that looks about like this. You should have the 01 fixed effects, should be the one that's open. That's the one we're going to ultimately go in and start with. Now we go in and we begin working inside of here. There's multiple ways that we can actually go about applying effects to them. We can go ahead, if we have the individual clip selected in there, we can double click on the effect. It's going to go ahead and apply it to it. The other thing we can do is we can drag it from the effects panel over and we can drop it on the clip and it'll apply it that way as well. We can apply many different effects to individual clips. Now as we add them in there, you'll see we'll add them and we'll start looking at the effects controls. What's going to happen is they're each going to be in their own little individual compartment that allows us to go in and adjust them. We can toggle open and close the disclosures to be able to see those and ultimately go in and adjust them if you would like. The ones that are in here aren't the only ones that are available. Of course, you can go in and download things third party. You'll find some that are free. So if there's certain effects that are out there, some people will go through and generate things. You can go ahead and you can grab those and import those into it. A lot of times those effects are going to go into the folder for the system. So with that, figure out where exactly you installed it at and you'll find the locations to drop in those effects. A lot of times they're just plugins that'll go in there and operate as well. Now depending on what it is that you're working with, some of the things are very simple. I mean on movements. So if we go in and start to deal with opacity, just how opaque is that individual layer, remembering that as we go through and we start to work with the items inside of the tracks, that anything on the upper video tracks, so video 2 is going to play over top video 1, so if we play with opacity on the video 2, it's going to allow us to see through to what is behind it, which would be on video 1. The main area where we go and we start to work with these, if we're dealing with title blocks and things along those lines, where we're going to play with the opacity, drop the opacity down at times. That's one thing that we would see with that. Now, know that anytime we go through and we add in any clips to our sequences, what we're going to find inside of here is that we do have some basic items that are automatically on all of our clips. So we're not going in, it's not like you have to go in and add something to be able to control certain aspects of it. So we do have the ability to come in here and look at these, what we consider fixed effects. And that's because with them, as we go through and we apply them, these are automatically fixed into them. So with these, we start going in to deal with things that are either geometric in setup. So as we start to look at the size of it, opacity, speed, and even a little bit that we can deal with inside of our audio properties as well. So we go through and we start to look at them. Why are they in here? Well, first off, we have our motion. So we go ahead and toggle that open. We're going to see inside of there is this is all set, allowing us to essentially go through. We can animate, we can rotate, and we can also go in and scale our clip inside of here. There are additional controls inside of here dealing with the anti-flicker. So as things go through and they start to move, what can end up happening is we can see it to where the object appears as though as it moves frame to frame. If it were to be moving, it's going to look like it's flickering versus going in there and being a nice smooth transition. So we can go and we can adjust that anti-flicker as well. So we come in and we adjust our position. As we go through to work with that, all of this works off of where exactly is it using as the reference point for that. So if we go in here and you see if we drag to the right, it's going to move it to the right. This is our X. Drag it to the left, it'll go back and move that. Second would be our Y value. So up and down. So yes, we can allow, if you think about some of the other transitions that are in there, yes, we could have it go ahead and do the slide, or if you wanted to have additional controls over things, we go ahead and we can actually put keyframe and make the slide transitions happen manually. Scale allows us to scale up, scale down. So if we're looking at still frames, if we bring them in, they're naturally going to come in. It's going to fill that frame. So with that frame filled, if we wanted to scale that up to be able to come in here and have our image here, we can come in and we can start to work with this video, and we can play with where exactly is it at. So do we want to see the whole body? We want to bring it over? Are we going to play with it moving? There's a lot of things that we can go in and ultimately do with these fixed controls. You will see uniform scale in here. If you uncheck our uniform scale, then as we go in, you're going to see we have scale height and scale width up here. So there's our scale height and width.
That. Could you try again?
No, Siri, I won't try again. So with that, you'll see the two values for scale width and scale height, unless, of course, you have uniform scale on. Then you'll see that it just says scale. Scale width goes back and just drops out to being grayed out. So that is one change. Why it leaves it on there instead of disappearing is beyond me. Rotation. So we go through and we start to look at rotation. So positive rotates clockwise. Negative is going to rotate us counterclockwise. As you go through, if you start to work with things, want to animate objects coming in and out, that's one way to go through and work with it. The anchor point, where exactly is our anchor point? So if we go ahead and we click on this, you'll see with that anchor point selected. So with that selected here, we can see it's highlighted out here. Should default right to the center of what you have in there. So if you want to move where that anchor point is to work off of a corner, you can go in there. We could click on it. We could drag it to that upper corner, which you'll see then the anchor point goes to 0, 0. That's our upper left-hand corner. So if you are aligning things or working with objects or want to move a certain part of it, that would be the way to go ahead and set it. If you wanted to focus on, say, the eye of this, we go ahead and we could drop it there so that you know that wherever the eye is at is in location or a reference to where that anchor point is at as well. And as I said, you can turn off the anchor flicker, anti-flicker as well. We close that up. We come back here to our opacity. So this allows us to go in and work with objects. So when we go through and we start to look at, so let me, I was just resetting the anchor point back. So if we come in and we look at opacity, this allows us to go in and work with masks. So we'll work a little bit with the mask a little bit later. But when we go through, we can either create ellipses as masks, or we can do rectangular masks. And then we can also free draw to go in and create our own shape to make a mask out of it. This goes for our opacity. So we go through and start to look at it. How opaque is it, 100% or 0? So you can see, you can start to work with that. If you start to think about transitions, the fade to black, it's really the same thing here. We could just take this, set up a time, and change the opacity to fade out to black or another color or anything else that's behind it inside of there as well. Blend modes work exactly the same as they do anywhere else inside of the Adobe suite. They are categorized to have similar features to them. So when we go through and sort of look at darken, multiply, color, burn, linear burn, darker color are going to have similar impacts to one another, just like lighten, screen, color dodge, linear dodge, lighter color would have as well. So once you get comfortable working with the blend modes, note they will work the same inside of here. The last one is our time remapping. So this allows us to go in and work with our speed. So how fast is this playing? We can speed it up, we can slow it down. You can do the same thing as we go through and we start to look at, if you play something, you want to go to a slow motion. You can go ahead and we can deal with keyframing inside of here as well to have it play at 100%, and then at one point, all of a sudden I want it to slow down. And we can either take that and have it immediately slow down, or we can go ahead and we can ramp it down, have it play at a slower speed because we want, then speed it back up. So if you think about the boomerang videos that you can shoot on your phones and stuff like that, same process, except for instead of the software going through and running it while you're taking it, you have full control over it inside of here. If you toggle that down, there's many of these. If we come in, we start to look at, if you toggle them down, what you're going to see in here are sliders. Or in this case, when we come over here and we start to look at the speed, what you're going to see on here is this bar here indicates the speed at which it's going through and playing itself out. So those are all the fixed effects that are inside of here. As we go through, if a clip were to have audio, you would also then see an audio option on there as well, which allows you to go in and control some of the basic things dealing with volume. If it's on a channel, doing channel volumes, and also going in and starting to look at panner controls. So if you want to have it move from left to right, do we want sounds from one video just to be playing on the left? So if you're going through and you're having a video up there and the focus is the bird happens to be on the left side of the frame, you could of course set up the audio so that more sound comes out of that left side versus the right side. So some simple things like that to go through and use with it. You can modify all of them. So if you wanted to come down here and we start to look at what's happening in here, so we can see what's going on here. So on the first one, there aren't any effects in here that we're working with. If we come over here and we choose the second one, you're going to see that there's a change how it goes in here, and it essentially zooms in or scales the video up so it draws attention to the face. You may see this on a lot of different apps. They list the Ken Burns effect. Essentially that's what this is. It's going in there and just that simple scale is drawing focus to the key object. So if we go ahead and we grab this and we come in and we start to look inside of here. So with the second one selected, if you come up here and you toggle open your motion, what you're going to see up here, these are keyframes. So you'll see here that we are at the very beginning. These are our keyframe controls. So when the center diamond is highlighted, what that ends up being is it's indicating you're actually on a keyframe. If you were to click on that where it says add remove keyframe, you're going to delete the keyframe that's there. The arrow allows us to jump to the next keyframe, and once we're on that keyframe, it allows us to jump back by using the first one to go previous keyframe. So what we're seeing here as we start to look at the position is where exactly, or not position, because position doesn't change. Well, it must change a little bit, but scale comes in here. We start to look at how it goes through and works its way up on our scale. So as we start to drag this across, that's where we start to see what's happening with the scale of it. So we can see those changes. So these are allowing us to go in and look at what are those fixed effects. Now you can go in if you want to and adjust them. As you start to look at the keyframes, if you went back and you play them, you can see the difference with them. What starts to happen when we go through and we start dealing with motion is if we have something that's really static, like in this case, it's sitting still, it's not going anywhere. I mean, there's very, very little movement. All you have there is you can see it breathing, you can see a little bit with the eyes, you can see it look down at whatever that item is that's crawling on it, probably an ant. So with that, you can see that, but then we jump to this one, how much more interesting, even just something as subtle as zooming in. Because as we go through, we start to think about things. When things are moving, they draw our attention. They grab our attention. They keep us keep us involved in what's there. We're inside of that closed design because that dynamics of the movement is going to continue to keep drawing us into it. So when we start to look at what happens with things, what happens with videos, really, like I said, the Ken Burns effect came in, the big push on that, where we saw that dealing with still frames. So that way, as they're scaling, as they're maybe panning on the screen, it's done to, of course, keep us interested in it, keep us looking at the stuff, keeping something moving. As the movement goes in there, again, we're engaged with it. So think about ways that we can use that to allow us to go into what is here. Now we go through, we have these fixed effects. Like I said, these are on every single thing that we bring into it. But there are also additional effects then that allow us to go in and make adjustments to it. So if you come down in the lower left, you'll see that we have our effects panel down here. Now inside of our effects panel, there are a lot of things that we can ultimately go in here and work with. But the main ones inside of here gets inside of our video effects. So we go through and pull up our video effects. These are all different areas that we can go in and use. So there is one in here that shows obsolete ones. That you'll see there's a lot of them in here. This will actually guide us back into ones. These are older ones. There are newer ones that have been in there and added in that are better designed. However, if you go in and you start to work with some older projects, or you bring something in, we've all worked inside of an Adobe application, and we try to open up something and we use something on a previous version and that doesn't exist inside there anymore, and then all of a sudden it breaks it. The big thing used to be, and I haven't had this issue now for many years, but it used to be, I mean, even something as simple as using a gradient inside of an application. Based upon gradient controls, you import it or you go to print it, and all of a sudden the gradient looks nothing like it's supposed to because of a change in the application. So they have taken all of these that have been replaced by newer, better effects and left them in there, so if that were to be applied to a previous project, you open that project up in there, it will still actually show up. So unlike other applications where we really have to worry a lot about what we're using for effects and start talking about them for the longevity of it, you know, what is the life cycle of it, keep in mind that it is still possible though that you could go through and use something, and when you try to reopen it, all of a sudden it does not work. So we go through and we start looking what's inside of here. They are inside of bins to help you make it easier for you to go through and ultimately navigate what is in here. So are we making adjustments? If so, then we're looking inside of our adjustments. So here's levels, lighting effects, blurs and sharpens. So you'll start to see, if you think about it from Photoshop standpoint, this is what we see underneath the sharpen filters. So directional blurs, Gaussian blurs, sharpens. We can go and do it on sharp masks. We'll go down here and we start looking at channels. What are we dealing with our channels? So dealing with inversions, color corrections. So how do we ultimately want to go in and adjust the colors? Are we distorting something? Okay, if we're distorting it, what do we want to go in here and work off of? So think about corner pinning. If we're going in and we're placing a video that's going to be showing on another screen or another surface, we can go and we can corner pin it so it will automatically go through and deal with the distortions equal to the shape of the screen. Lens distortion, spherizing. If we want to offset something, do we want to generate something? So generate a lens flare, generate lighting. We'll start looking at ramps for color. Image control, do we want to cut it down to black and white? Keying. So we go through and we start thinking about keying, going in and being able to map certain things out. So we start getting into what is that we want to remove, what color do we want to use as our backdrop. So green screen, blue screen, orange screen, yellow screen, whatever screens you're using. So go ahead and select the colors to key out a certain color. We can do that. Noise and grain, adding noise and that in there, controlling noise. There's the obsoletes. Do we want to work with perspectives? What are we doing with that? So there's our drop shadow, if you're looking for that. Stylize. So you'll recognize a lot of these coming in from other applications. So when you start to see them, they do the same type of stuff. Time, what are we doing with time? How are we working with the time? What transformations do we want to make to it? So do we need to go in and crop something? Are we going to flip something? Do we want to soften an edge? Transitions, we've been into utilities, and then other ones are coming down here for just video. So as we go through and we start to look at these, as you went through some of those, you may see a few different symbols on them, and they actually go up here and relate to what we have up here on the top, that we can use these to filter out what it is that we're going in and using. So we go through and we look at this first one where we see the lines and the arrow where it looks like it's running. These are all accelerated effects. So with that, it allows us to go through and they can be accelerated utilizing the graphic processor unit or the GPU inside of your computer. So as we go through, we start to look at these. If we get into, and in the past, you'll see stuff that talk about Mercury Playback Engine. So with that, these here will actually allow you to go through, and a lot of times when they go in and utilize them, it's going to be real time. You're going to be able to see exactly what's going on in there. If not, though, we're going to start to see things then that ultimately have to be rendered out. Usually you can see these. Probably on these machines, you should be fine on these. If you're using an older machine, then the only way you're going to get to see them is by rendering out what is there. The next one's over. These are for 32-bit. So these are 32-bit color. So with this, it's going into 32 bits per channel. With that, you may see it talking about a high bit depth. A lot of times when we're working with stuff, it's not uncommon, we're talking 8-bit, maybe 16-bit. But when we get into 32-bit, this is going to allow us to go through and work with things that give us a lot more depth when it comes down to overall color with it. When we go through, we start to look at it inside of the software. If you don't have GPU enabled, or if your machine won't run it, then of course it's going to be displaying it as 8-bit because that's all it can process anyways. So with that, as you add in more stuff, when we start talking about it from 32-bit, when we talk about from bit processing, standard 8-bit, that's our 0 to 255. So you start thinking about colors, RGB, 0s to 255. Zeros are all black, 255s make it white. So when we go through and start looking at those, just know that when we get into it, just jumping up to 10-bit is 1023, and then once we get up to 32-bit, there's over 4 billion possible steps inside of that. So if we start to think about it as things start to run, just remember that as we go through to use that, know that it's going to be additional power. So again, machine-wise, but it is capable of working with that. And then the last one to the right, which says YUV. This actually goes in, it really goes off of, essentially it's a 2-channel process plus illuminance. So we go through HSL. When we start looking at that from a standpoint, we think Photoshop, hue, saturation, and luminance. Well, the Y value inside of here is actually the luminance or luminosity channel. And then with that, the U and the V are actually 2 channels when we go through and we start looking at it from color. Now what ends up happening from a standpoint of Premiere Pro is it really is looking at it as Y is your luminance, and then we deal with blues and red channels. So as we combine those, that's how we go through and start to adjust what we have inside of there for the colors. So as we go through and start to think about it, it does allow us to go through and adjust contrast and also work with exposures without actually going through and causing a shift in colors. If we go through and we start to look at it, if we don't have anything with that added to it, so when we start looking at effects, if you have effects in there and they're not YUV type effect, then it's going to just stick to the standard RGB colors. So you're not going to be in a position where you're not going to be able to work with what is there. Now, as I said, inside of here, we do have all of our effects available to us down here. If you go in and you start working with items inside of your video effects and you decide you want to come in here, you can come down here to the lower right. You'll see it says new custom bin. This will allow us to go in and create ourselves a custom folder for it. So once you click on that, you'll see at the very bottom, it comes up and says custom bin 1. So we can come in here and decide that we want to do something else with this, or we can work with other objects inside of there. So if I were to click on this, you can give it some name. If you wanted to go ahead and, use initials, you can do stuff like that. And then what will happen with this is it does allow us then, if we have certain effects that we want to use or you find yourself using regularly. So if you come in here and you're like, oh, I like to use the lighting effects. You can come down and you can drop that in there. It's going to stay in the other folder as well, so you're not going to lose anything. Oh, I like to use corner pin. So bring that down into there. I like the wave warp. I like to do the time warp too, but I haven't brought that in here. So come down here, time warp. Drop that in. What else do I use a lot of? Keying. I'll come in here and use color key. So as you go through and you start to look at things that you're using, you can go ahead and you can drop them in there. Some people even go as far as like when they're working on just a specific project, they'll list it in there. So if I'm working with a certain thing and I know I'm using these same effects over and over again, I'll drop those in there. So I have one, it's inside there. So then when I get to my effects, I'm no longer having to search. I can just simply come down here. I can open up my effects. The rest of them can be toggled completely shut. And I can even come up here and get rid of the video effects disclosure. So this allows me to go in and control what is inside of there and lets me work with them. And I'm no longer digging around, searching inside of the other folders, trying to figure out where was it I found that one at? What exactly was the name of it again? You can come in here and say, oh yeah, I'm keying with color key. So when we start getting into different things, you'll find them in there. If you add in third party, a lot of times your third party ones have their own folder. So whatever the company is, it'll have that and it'll be listed inside of there. So it does allow us to go in and work with them. If we came in here and we wanted to get rid of one, you can see we can just select it and hit delete and it will remove it from being inside of there. You'll also notice as it goes through, each of those just simply shows up as an alias. So you'll see it's got the icon, but then it's got the arrow in there indicating it's just an alias going back into the other area. So it's going to apply itself the same way as any other. Simply hit delete. Okay, confirm it. So as we go through and we start to work, that allows us to go in and remove those. If you have an entire folder, we can also come in and you can see if we delete that, same thing. You want to delete this item, we say okay. Notice the folder now is gone. So you can easily go in and create your own folders, your own bins to work out of inside of there if you are going to go in and begin to use them. Now for anything that we go through and we start to work with, for just about every control that's available to you is going to have the ability to keyframe. If you haven't worked with keyframes that much, then get used to working with them because they are the same as we start going in and all the way through them. So we talked a little bit about keyframes. So when we go in here and start to work, we have the little stopwatch. If the stopwatch is toggled on and we see that this is blue, that's indicating it's recording a keyframe. Now, why is that important? Well, we do have keyframes that are inside of here, and we see that what's going to happen with them. The other thing that's important with it is if we were to come in here and change this value at any point, you'll see here I moved it over. You'll see inside that it does create a new keyframe. That's because once we turn on keyframing, it is going to go in there and begin to record what is happening with that. The other thing to get used to or recognize is that if you don't want a keyframe on there, with it on a keyframe, which you'll see here, we can simply go ahead and we can click on that and you'll notice the keyframe disappears. Now, if I undid that and I click back on here again, you're going to notice that this went back to a different location. So that's where I had it at. When I turned it off, it went back to here. Simply clicking a new keyframe back on is just going to place this in the exact same location it's currently in. It is not going to go back to what it was in prior to me removing the keyframe, because once I remove the keyframe, it goes back to read where is it at on the tween of the keyframes. So keep that in mind, because some people have turned it off and they're like, wait, no, I wanted that on. And instead of hitting Command Z, they're going to go ahead and go click it back on, and then they're wondering why it doesn't move. It's because it has gone in there and it is adjusted to that. If this center is not highlighted blue, you are not actively on a keyframe, which is important because if I simply just take this and move this over by one frame, I'm no longer on a keyframe. If I adjust the location of this thinking that I'm fixing that one before there, you're going to see that it snaps and jumps over. So as you go through and you start working, if you want a new position, then it's important, of course, that you're not on a keyframe. If you want to go ahead and adjust a keyframe, then it is critical that you are on a keyframe here. So as you go through, this is where these arrows come in. If you look closely, I'll jump this off here for a second. If you look closely, you can see that it goes in there. There's a big change. And then it moves itself back down to match up with where that's going across there. So as we start to look at what's happening with it, know that that's how we can navigate those keyframes. So if I didn't want this one, I can come over to that keyframe and remove it. If I jump back, because right now we're not on a keyframe, so if I jump back over to that other middle one and I go ahead and remove it, now it's right back to the way that it looked before. So keep in mind as you go through and you start to work with those keyframes that this is what it allows us to go in and do with it. So now that we've played with ones that are actually here, let's go ahead and let's take a look at working with some other keyframes. Let's go back over to our project, and we have one called O2 Browse. Let's go ahead and open that one up. And this is what we have on here. So she goes over, she's running away. Police are chasing her. Sounds better than something else. Elephant chasing her on the top of a building. So as we go through and start to look at it, like I said, anytime that we go through and have stuff, we have those basic effects that are available to us. So there are the ones that are set. And we talked before, if there's audio, you'll have audio. So there's our audio volume channel and panner. So with that, we can go in here, we can start to see what's happening with it. We can come in here, we can see volume, and lastly, the panner. So we start looking at the balance from right to left. So those are all the ones that we see in there. Those are those fixed effects that come with any clip. It'll recognize, of course, if there is audio. If there's audio, then we're going to see the audio on there as well. So let's go in and we're going to add something to this. So let's go to our effects. And we'll simply come up here to our search menu and we'll type in white and see what we get on here. So we can start to look, if I zoom out just a little bit, we can see in here black and white, dip to white. If you're looking for black and white, what happens if we type in black? Now when we do that, you're going to see you get a lot of different ones. And that's because what it's also looking at, Hero 3, which is a camera. So we can go in here, we can start to see what's happening with it. These are the effects from it. What this allows you to do is it allows you to go in and start to work with different videos. So if you are shooting stuff with multiple cameras, you can find different controls. So you're going to see a lot more stuff in here if you go in and you search for black. So Blackmagic Cinema. These are all different presets that are inside of here, effects that are inside of here. So as you go through and start to search, you're also going to start to see that certain ones that you use, when you go to search for them, you're going to identify what word you actually want to use. Do we still get the same black and white on here? Yes, it's right down here under image control. But you'll see there's a lot more that you have to scroll through if you go in and type in black versus typing in white. So as you go in and you start to work with that, again, we're looking at as you use it. When you first start with it, you're like, oh, I want to make this black and white. You're probably going to start off and type in black. And then you're going to have to scroll through there. So the more that you use them, the more that you'll understand what it is that you want to search with. So what we're really going for is our black and white here underneath of image control. We can come in and we can go ahead and we can drag and we can drop that out there. You'll see that it takes it to black and white. Remember, we can also, it is selected over there. So if I double click on it, it will also apply it to that. Depending on what you're working on, depending on how many videos you have in there, and depending on whether or not you see it selected out there, you're going to start to see, are you someone who does the drag drop mainly, or are you someone who likes to select it and double click? For me, I tend to be more of the drag drop. So for that, I would go over, grab a hold of that, bring it out there, and drop it onto what is there. Now we go through and we work to add in our items to it. What we can do with that is once we add an item onto here, we can go ahead and we still have control over it. So we may add effects to it, we may play with effects on it, we may see how effects work with each other. We don't necessarily have to delete them. If we want to see kind of how it runs with or without and what the impact is, if you come up here to the effects controls, you'll see we have this effects right on here, and if you hover over it, it will say toggle on and off. If you go ahead and click that off, notice it goes back to color. If I click it back on, it goes back to black and white. So if you add an effect to there and you're like, oh, I'm not really sure if I want to use that or not, instead of deleting it, I recommend just turning off the effect, and then after you do everything, get everything done, you can render it out with the effect turned off. You can render it out with the effect turned on. And then you can kind of see what happens with that versus going in there and having to fight with what do I want to do with it? Do I not want to do it? If you get to the end and you ultimately decide that you don't want it, we can just select it and hit delete and it'll disappear. So you can feel free to add different items into there. If we come back down into our effects, let's go in here and search for something else. Let's type in direction. And with that, you'll see we get this directional blur option that shows up. Since I have that selected over there, I can double click, or as I said, I tend to be more of a drag and drop, so I'll drag it out there and I will drop it into my sequence. And with that, if you look in the effects controls, you'll then see that we have directional blur available to us up here. Now inside of here, we do have this direction control, so we can toggle it open. You'll see it just gives you the dial, or you have the number. Same thing we get into blur length. We've got the number. We also have a slider. The slider and the number do the same exact thing. So with that, you can choose to either open them or not. We can hover over top of it, which of course gives us the hand, and we can go ahead and we can play with what do we want for a direction. Now we can go ahead and we can adjust the direction all we want. If we have no blur length, it's not going to do anything to the pixels. If you start to grab a hold of blur length, now you'll start to see the change in there. You can start to adjust which way is it going. If you look at it, it's kind of like if you're rotating lenticular thing on there. We start to see how it changes what we have on there. Super blurry. There are ways that we can have things come into view, possibly. So when we think about them, don't think about them just from the standpoint of what is normally used for. Think about other creative ways you could also go in and start to work with this to create different effects to work off of. So let's just go ahead and set our direction up here to 75. And I'll hit tab down here and let's look at what we have for a blur length. Let's go ahead and put that at 45 so we can go through and we can see what's happening with it. So when we go through and we start to look at stuff. Now we can go ahead and we can start to look at how might we use something like this. I mean, we can go and we can do something that's a really quick pan to it. So it's really fast, which they refer to as a whip pan. But the other thing when we start to look at it is what happens as we start to adjust it. What is our goal on this? Are we looking for something strictly for motion standpoint? If that's the case, then we'd probably want to be able to see what is going on with it. So when we start looking at what can we see and what can't we see, the blur direction just is what angle are those strokes going to be on, if you think about it from that standpoint. And we go and we start to look at the blur length as just how long are those going to be. So we can go ahead and we can click on that. And then what I like to do with a lot of stuff as I work is I use my arrow keys. So I'll hit the down arrow, which is going to allow us to adjust what is there. So we can reduce this down. So if we're kind of looking at it from a movement standpoint now, what's happening with it. So we can put a little bit of a blur on there as we're trying to look at motion. So now you can still see the action. If you want just a really subtle blur, we could drop that down to 1. And the same type of thing. So it helps blur as we go through and we start to get to our motion. Now, if we're going in here and we're trying to see what it is that we're working with, if you go to the panel menu up here for our effects controls, you'll see different options in here, including one down here that says remove effects. So if we go through and we start to look at what's happening here, if we go in and we click on remove effects, it's going to pop up with the remove attributes. So this is the dialog box that's going to come up. Now as we go through and we select this, what is it you want to go ahead and change? So these are all the things we can change. So if you had motion on, it'll throw those out as well. If you had opacity, it's going to do that. Time remapping, you'll see the effects. So it does go off of those fixed. And then also any other effects that are inside of here. The other thing down here then, audio-wise, it can go through and it can adjust the audio. So if we were to look at what was open up here, there were a few other ones that were on here. So let's just toggle these open. We can start to see how it kind of worked with what's in here. The blue ones being ones that it's currently recording anything that we do to our audio or video. So if we come in here and we decide to adjust it, what happens when we remove them? Well, we have all those things on there. We go ahead and say, okay. It's going to go through, it's going to remove anything that's in there. So now we'll see that our effects has disappeared. And it's gone through and adjusted the items. So if we had keyframes in other areas, you may see those disappear as well, since we're actually removing all of those attributes. So you can quickly remove stuff. If you really go in there and majorly screw things up, we can go in and quickly remove any of those attributes that were applied to it by using that drop down. Now we go through and we start looking at effects. They do actually go out in a certain order. So as we go through and start to work with them, watch what's happening with them, how we go through and place the effects in here. So if we came in here and we add a directional blur, and then if we come in, clear that out, and we decide to look at levels. So as we get in there, what we're going to start to see is we're going to have these different ones inside of here. So as we go through and start to work with them, know that as you go through and use them, as certain things process, as certain things work, we can only move certain elements. So watch that as we go through and we start to use them. You may find that as you use them, you might get some unintended effects to them. So start to look at that, because as we go through to use, as we start to stack up and how you're using the effects and that, if they run into an area, you may get unintended consequences of the item that is underneath of there. So with that, you'll start to work with things, you'll start to use effects, and you'll begin to find certain ones work better than others. And you may be used to using one thing, and you may have to use a different one, which will have similar effects again, but not identical. So that's something that you're just going to have to get used to as you go in and begin to play with them, because then it allows us to go through and start to change that stacking order as to how they're actually going to go in there and occur. Because like I have no control, I can't move the levels and directional blur up beyond opacity. So if I do something with the opacity, is that going to work? Well, no, if that's not working and I need the opacity change, well, you're going to have to change to what it is that you're using to allow them to go in and work. So another thing that we also have available to us, we're using effects right now. What else we can do is we can go and we can start to look at adjustment layers. Now what's convenient about adjustment layers, up to now we've been using effects. Effects are being applied to an individual clip, so they're on that layer. If we go and we start looking at adjustment layers then can be added onto it, and they will impact every clip that is below it. So it's a way that we can go through if we're dealing with color correction. Instead of doing color correction on multiple clips, we can actually do a color correction over the entire video by going in there and putting an adjustment layer on it. So if we go in to do something like that, we need to make sure, of course, that it's on a higher track. So let's go into our project panel. Let's open up our O3 multiple effects. And if we start to look at what's here, if we go ahead and play what's here.
I can't do this. You fail because you're trying to control the elements of your body. You must learn to use not just your body, but your mind and your heart. Remember, Paladin, the mind and the heart are infinitely more powerful than the body. So I can control the elements of my mind. If you try to be in control of the elements, you will also fail. You can no more control the elements than a flower can raise the sun. What you do not understand is that the elements are one with us. One.
So with this, what we have is we have multiple clips that are inside of here. And we want to be able to go in and make some adjustments to this without having to do it for each individual clip. I didn't count the number of clips in here, but there's probably easily 20 clips inside of here. So we don't want to go in and add the effect to each one and have to make the adjustments to each one of them. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and create ourselves a new adjustment layer to go inside of here. So we're in our project panel over here. We're just going to come down here to the lower right. We're going to click on New Item. Once you go ahead and you click on your new item down here, we're going to go and choose ourselves an adjustment layer. Now it's going to come over here and ask us what we want to do with our adjustment layer. In this case, it should give you the video settings that are going to match up with what you have inside of your sequence already. So with that set, we're just going to go ahead and click on OK. So you'll see that we have a new adjustment layer. It's created over here inside of our project panel. And what we're going to do is we're simply going to go ahead and drag that out here. We're going to drop that, make sure we're back here at the beginning of our sequence. So we're going to drop that on video track 2. So it's above there, which means it's going to impact anything that is down and below it. Now what's nice about it is once we go and we place it, it has a default duration inside of here. So based on it though, we're going to come in here to the right side of it so that we get our ability to go ahead and adjust the length of this. So we're just going to click on there. We're going to drag this out so that it goes to the full length. So if you have snapping turned on, it'll allow us to trim all the way out, and we can drop that off right at the very end. Also, as you go through and you start to work, we can go ahead and if we hit end, you'll see it goes and plays itself out to there. So with that, you may need to move it just to drag that out, and it's going to connect to where the playhead is at all the way on the far side of it. So now we have that all the way out there. We've got our adjustment layer selected. What we're going to do is we're going to come in here, and with that, we can go ahead and we can add ourselves, in this case, a blur if we wanted to, the whole thing. So let's go ahead and come back over to our effects panel. And we're going to use a Gaussian blur. Even if you missed the G, like I just did, you'll see it's still going to show up on here. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to drop that out here onto that adjustment layer. If you were at the end, you're not going to see anything with it. So if we bring it back over here, we can start to see what's happening with this. So right now our blurriness is actually set to a 0. So if we went in and we were to add something right now, if we're not on a good clip, so if we were on one that's zoomed out, or in this case something like this, if we went in and we added ourselves a blur to it, well, we're not seeing how much exactly it's going because this is something that already based upon the light that's there is already creating a little bit of a blur effect to it. But really what we want to do is we want to get into some other areas. Like we can have these where we have a close-up of a face, which will allow us to go in and look at what's happening to it. Make sure that as you're choosing an effect, as you're using an effect, that you're on a frame that's going to allow you to see what the real impact is of it, especially based upon what is it that you're trying to communicate, what's the narrative of what it is that you are going in and adjusting. So as we go through and we start to look with that list, there's a couple things that we need to look at. Well, first off, when we go through and we create a blurriness effect to it, can we see what it is that we want to see in here? If we completely distort what it is that we're seeing, what are we trying to communicate? The other thing to watch is around the edge of the frame. You're going to see here it starts to get this vignette to it. That's because as we go through and we increase the blurriness, we're blurring it with what is essentially the background. So you can see if we slide this out, eventually we can get this all the way to black. So right now I'm over at 4,000 and it's black. As you start to scale it back down, or adjust the blurriness, I should say, of it, you'll start to see it lightens up in the middle of the frame, but we still have a vignette appearance on there. Well, if you use that repeat edge pixels, you'll notice that that vignette actually disappears. And that's because it's repeating those outside pixels. If you go large enough, you're going to get a little bit that's going to show up on there. But it does allow us to repeat those. So when we get back down to where we were initially at 25, you can really see the difference there as that vignette just disappears. So as we go through and we start to look at it, what is it that we are attempting to do? We want to do that evenly all the way out and across that. So as we go through and we start to work with this, what we have is we have our adjustment layer. As we place our adjustment layer on here, we start to see what's happening with everything that is there. Now as we go through and we start to select this, you'll see that we have those same options up here inside of our settings. So what's going on with that? What are our blur dimensions? So we just horizontal blurring, vertical blurring, or horizontal and vertical. But if we come in here and we go into our opacity, what we're going to see inside of our opacity by toggling that open is that ability to come in here and look at our blend modes. So right now when we start to look at what's happening with it is depending on what's going on with it. At this point, we're just placing a blur over that. Well, it's not really working with anything underneath of it. Yes, it's impacting it. But we can also go through and start to look at what can we do with how this is blended. So what happens if we go on darken? Now you'll see that something that we just added was simply a blur is now going in there to impact what is below that. So we can start looking at some stylized effects to it. And this is nothing more than a blur and blend modes. So when we go through and multiply, what happens? There's color burn, linear burn, and darker color. So all of these are playing off of course, darkening effects. We go in here to lighten. Look at what happens when we start dealing with lighten versus screen versus color dodge, linear dodge, and lighter color. You see these all play on making things, or typically are going to make it be brighter. So if you think about that first group under darken, that's what it does. It's going to darken things. If we go through and look at the next one that says lighten, that's ultimately what they're going to do. It's going to lighten what you're seeing. So know that when you go in and start to use those, that's how those are actually going to go in and play with one another. So then now if we come down here and start to look at what happens with overlay, soft light, hard light, and just like any other class that I talk about or any other time I'm talking about using blend modes, really we get into the standpoint that you're probably going to be playing with them until you see what it is that you're going for. Eventually it will get to the point to where there are certain effects, you know that when I use this one, it's going to knock out black. If I use this one, it's going to knock out white, and that's why I'm using it. So at the beginning, yes, you're going to go in here and you're probably going to play a little bit to figure out what exactly is it that you are going for, and then you're ultimately going to go back and settle on what it is that you think looks best. So in this case, we're going to go ahead and set this to soft light, and then if you see if we adjust the opacity, what happens with that is I go in here and start to use my arrow keys to bring that down. So taking it down to around 75%, which will reduce the effect that we're seeing inside of there. So we go through and we place something in there. Well, what's the difference? Well, if I come down and I toggle on and off the visibility of that adjustment layer, you can see what's happening with it. So this is with it on. This is what we originally started with. And all we're looking at is we're creating ourselves a blur to it. And as we go through and we start to use that blur, we're dealing with the blend mode. You can see that a lot of people, when they get started, may come in and try to use something else, doing color correction, brightness and contrast, things along those lines, where in this case, simply adding ourselves a blur and playing with the opacity of those fixed effects can allow us to get to the same spot without having to deal with all of the other effects that are available. Plus, the thing that's important is, remember, this goes through all of them. So I go to this one. Again, we can see it before and after. So it's a way for us to add something quickly to everything as opposed to going in and adjusting it to each individual clip that is there. Now we can also go through and apply effects into clips that are inside of our project panel. And with that, we can do those. Those are called master clips. So when we go through and start applying effects inside of there, typically you're going to hear those called master clip effects. So when we go through and we use any clip effects inside there, then any of the clips, sub-clips, and that are part of it are already going to have the effects that you've gone in and applied. So you don't have to go in, once you fix them inside there, you don't have to go in and change it once it becomes part of your sequence. So let's jump back over to our project panel. Let's open up this master clip effects. So with this, we have this LoRa O2 clip that's in there. You'll see it is done and used multiple times, 5 times actually to be exact inside of them. And then they are going to be separated by some other shots, and then it'll of course jump back to the other one. So we just want to be somewhere with this on that first clip. So that first LoRa O2 clip that's inside of here. And we want to go in and begin to work with that. Now if we go through and we double click on any of our items, what's going to happen is it's going to open up that instance that is inside of here. So we want to go ahead and look at the clips original master clip inside of the clip. So we have our clip here. If we go ahead and we select our clip, let's go ahead and hit the F key. What that's going to do is that's just a shortcut for match frame. So it's going to pop up inside of our source monitor and show us exactly where we're at. So I've selected it. My playhead is there. It's out at frame. It's at the 9-second mark. And by going in there and hitting F, we see our match frame pops up inside of the source monitor. So now we have the same clip that's open the source monitor. So this is our master clip. This is the one we've gone through and we want to be able to work with. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and we're going to jump down here into our effects. And inside of our effects, we're just going to type in 100, which is going to take us to this CineSpace 100 effect. So I'm going to go ahead and drag that up here, and I'm going to drop this onto the source there. Now we go through and do this. What ends up happening is it goes through and it changes this clip inside of here. So you start to see the fact that in the project panel out there now, we see that there is a change to it. So we have this set. So we're going to click inside of our source monitor. We're going to go in here to our effects controls. Now inside of here, you're going to see these. This is what's been added to it. So the Lumetri setup, which you'll see it's Lumetri preset CineSpace 100. So there we see for our color. We can actually look and see what controls do we have. Now there's a lot of controls that are available to us inside of here. You can go and you can change these as you go through and ultimately change these. What would happen with that is it goes through and it's going to be part of the rest of the clips. So if we go through and we start to look at this, this has been applied to that clip, that Laura 02. If we come out here, you'll see it's applied to the next one that's out here as well. It's in this instance as well. So we go through, we can add them to it. Now underneath of the badge in the upper left-hand corner of the clip, you're going to see that red line. That red line in there is indicating that you actually have a master clip effect that's being applied to it. So if you're wondering, how do I know if one's been applied, you're going to see that line that's underneath there. So the rest of the clips are going to automatically take what is there. So with that, if we come down here and we start to look at some of these other clips that are available to us, you'll see if I just come down here and I single click on any of these, they're going to go in there and they load up inside of our source up there. But what you'll see is by single clicking on those, we're not actually seeing the effects controls that are available to us on that upper part. So see effects controls. If we come over here and we click on any of these and we go ahead and we start to match up a frame, we're going to see the same thing. It pulls them up. And now if we go into our effects controls, we're going to see we have the ability to go ahead and adjust that master clip that is there. So as we go through and we start to work with them, start to use them, know that if that's what you're using, that we are going in there, we're selecting it and allowing us to go in and begin to work with the master clip effects that are available to us. So we start to see our source setup inside of here. As you begin working with them, the more that you go through and use, same thing. It's just like anything else. The more that you use it, the more that you become familiar with what is there. Questions yet? Okay. Anybody lost? Oh, not supposed to raise my hand? I'm just kidding. All right, so let's jump back over to our lessons inside of here, or our project panel, and let's go up to actually we're gonna deal with brightness and contrast. We're just gonna stay here inside of our master clips that's here, and let's go into this second clip here. So we have this one here as we start to deal with her. So this is the smile. What's this one called? I think this one's called Evening Smile. So let's go ahead and we're going to make some adjustments to this. So if we go ahead and jump to the beginning of this clip, we can play and you can see what we have. So that's the one that we're going to be working with. Remember, we can jump between edits by using our arrow keys. So we're going to go ahead and look at a brightness and contrast effect for this. So inside of our effects panel, let's clear out that 100. I'm going to start typing out brightness and contrast, and we'll see underneath of our color correction is our brightness and contrast. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring it out here and drop that onto my clip. Now with that, I'll see here my controls for my brightness and contrast. Once again, if you start to look at what's available in disclosures, if you drop those down, you're going to see sliders for them. We're going to go ahead and deal with some adjustments on here. So what happens if we go ahead and we deal with our brightness and our contrast? Well, if we drag them across, this is what we're going to start to see, making adjustments to what is here. If we go ahead and set our brightness to 35 and our contrast to 25, we go from having this to ultimately having this. So with that, we can help add some brightness to the frame or to the video, the clip, and we can also increase the contrast so we get a little bit of a shift to that, kind of help wipe out a little bit of that gray neutral feeling that we have inside of there. So we go through and we have this in here. Well, what if we want to go ahead and draw the focus instead of it being on the entire image or the entire video? Well, if we come in here to our brightness and contrast, we have the ability to go in and do an ellipse mask. So if we go ahead and we just click once on the ellipse mask, you're going to see it pops up. You'll see a mask 1 value inside of here. So it's gone through and it's added the mask into here. Well, we can go ahead and we can adjust what's going to happen with this mask. So I can come in here, I can click in this, and we can start to drag this mask around. Now what you should notice is that then the effect that we're applying to it is only going to happen inside of that individual mask that is there. All of these handles that we have out here allow us to grab this and adjust what's going to happen with our mask. So as we go through and we start to think about what is it that we're controlling? Well, this is going to allow us to go ahead and begin to blend out from one to the other. So this is, we can go ahead and we can adjust this until we have an appearance that we're looking for. Now, our key focus on this is going to be the face. So we're going to want to go ahead and we're going to adjust this to look at what we have based upon the face itself. So this is where we're going for on our focus. So we can go ahead and we can adjust what's there. So where is this point at? So we have a couple different ones that we can work off of. So this is going to increase the overall mask. It's going to allow us to adjust then ultimately where it goes through and feathers. So if you see as you start to move these, we're working with the widget that's on here. If you were to look over at the left as you go through to change these, what's happening with the values as you go through and move these individual controls. So we grab the little square diamond here and move that. You'll see that that's our mask expansion. How much do we want it to expand out from its initial shape that we have on there? This allows us to adjust on our feather. So as you move that, you're going to see you're going to have a difference on the mask feather over there. As you go through and move those, we're looking at it visually. I'm very much visual. So I'm looking at it. The numbers don't mean as much to me as it does on the overall look of it. So what we're ultimately going to do is we want to set this up, and we're going to set up our mask to match over on here. Now, you may decide you don't want to do anything with the expansion. So you could leave the expansion. I'm just going to go and reset that to 0. We also could go in here. There's the reset buttons on the right that will reset everything back. So we can go in here, we can change it. So we have no expansion, but I go ahead and I adjust my feather out. If I didn't want my feather, I can go ahead and click on that, and you'll see it snaps the feather back down. So you can go through and start to see what happens as we go through and use it. And what's the difference between it? Before, after. So we can see that really what we're focusing on by creating this and putting the mask on there is we're using brightness and contrast in some ways to create a lighting effect. So we're going to actually create what looks like highlight as we go in and begin to work with what is on the face. So it allows us to go in and adjust this to where we are at. So that's our mask set up to it. Now, another thing you're going to see inside of here is this mask path. And that's because as we go through and we start to look at this, we see that things end up moving. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and start to adjust what's going to happen with this. So we have this set. We have this mask path on here. Inside of here, we can track selected mask backwards, and we can go ahead and track mask forward, and we can go mask forward by 1 frame. So if we go ahead and we hit play, it's going to go through, and it's going to look at what we have inside of there, and you'll see that it goes through and adjusts where that is at. So if we look at stuff in the past, if you've used After Effects, we start dealing with rotoscoping, we start to track, and that's kind of what happens with this. Well, the same thing's going on as we go through and begin to work in here. It's looking at what's there, it checks what's going on with it, and then allows itself to go through and play forward. So now if we go ahead and we scrub, you'll see that the focus stays on what we have there. So it does allow us to go through and control that item. So now if I were to deselect and then play it, that effect is applied then across and allows that to go through and move. We go in here to 05, dealing with keyframes. So if we go through and start to look at what's happening, we got this waterfall in here, so we can see how this goes through and plays itself up. What we're going to do is we're going to start looking at a lens flare. We're just going to create a lens flare on here, and we're going to allow a lens flare to go through, and we're going to animate where the lens flare goes to. So let's go ahead and we're going to get back to the very beginning. Let's get into our effects. Let's go ahead and come down here, and we're looking for a lens flare. So you can go ahead and start typing out, and you'll see it's under generate. We have lens flare, and I'm just going to go ahead and bring that out here and drop it on my clip. Once again, in the effects controls, we're going to see that we have a lens flare show up on there. There's where we have our lens flare. Well, with that, we want to go ahead and adjust where that lens flare ultimately is at. So we're going to go ahead and move our lens flare. So there's our lens flare center. If we go ahead and select our lens flare center, you're going to see out here, you get our little bullseye. We can grab a hold of that and we can decide where do we want to move that to and what's going to happen with it. So we can bring it up here more towards the top of our waterfall. So we can have that set. If we go through and we play it, you'll know that the lens flare is just sitting there. Well, we want that to ultimately move from one spot to the next. So this is where it's starting at. We want to go ahead and move to the end of it. So with that, I have this set. I want to go ahead and create the keyframes. Now that I've placed this in there and I have that slated right up there at the top, what we need to do is we need to make sure we turn those keyframes on. So with that, we're going to click on the stopwatch for our flare center. We're also going to adjust our brightness before we go through and move this, because since it's up toward the top, we're going to want to ultimately drop it down a little bit in brightness. So I'm going to even come in here. I'll just go 50. How does that look? Yeah, we'll go with 50. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to toggle on the stopwatches next to flare center and flare brightness. So they will be blue. That way, when I go ahead and take this to the end of this, I want to go ahead and I'm going to jump back 1 frame, just so that way I'm on the last frame of it. And I want to go ahead and adjust where this lens flare is at. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and toggle on my flare center, and I want to go ahead and bring that down and keep that into here. So now if we go ahead and we have it adjusted, you'll see as soon as I move it down there, it creates that new keyframe because I have the stopwatch turned on, so it is following anything that I go in and ultimately change with it. As I bring it down, I'm going to go ahead and make that get brighter. I still don't want it to be at 100% for me at least, so I'm going to put it at 75%. And then if we go through and you start to scrub it, you'll see that as that begins to move, or see frame by frame, you can see that that's sliding along what is there. So with that said, I'm just going to go ahead and jump back to the beginning in spacebar preview. You'll see as that comes down then how that keyframe allows that lens flare to move with it. So start and the end. So that mist that's getting created kind of by that, and I'd still want to come in and adjust it a little bit more so that it stays more with that area where it starts. But there's a way that we can go in, ultimately add ourselves a keyframe and allow it to move. In this case, it's still working very linear in the sense that it's a constant movement. So remember, we can toggle these open. We can see kind of the pace as these things move. So with that, they're consistent. If we jump over into our interpolation, this is how does it go through and interpret what's happening between them. So if we go and we select this, we play this out, we can see the action that occurs on there. So as we start to look at what do we want to do with this for additional controls. Well, we can see a lens flare is applied to this. So if I select this, we can see there's the lens flare that's inside of this clip. And we can see what actions are taking place utilizing that. So we see the lens flare right there. As it goes through and plays, you can see where it's moving at. Again, that's been generated. It's not actually from the camera itself. So let's go into the very beginning of our clip and then make sure that we have our clip ultimately selected. If we come up here, what's happening with our lens flare? Well, we can toggle that on and off. You can see what's happening with this, what adding this does for it. If you play it without it, you can see it doesn't have as much, I mean, it's got the action too there, but we're not seeing the light looking at it from an atmosphere standpoint. So as we toggle that on and off, you can see what's happening as we go through and play it. Well, what happens if we want to go through and adjust how that actually is adjusted as it goes in there? We start to look at the speed and how quickly it starts to move. As I start talking about keyframes, we start talking about them, I always talk about them as train stations. We leave a keyframe, so between the two keyframes is the track. So at the beginning, for it to start, we're going to ease in, or ease out, because we're easing into the motion, but out of the station. We're easing out at the end because we're easing into the station. So it's into the throttle, out of the throttle, if you kind of think about certain ways that are happening with it. So we're going to ease out of our station at the beginning. So we're going to come in here to our flare controls. So if we look at our flare center property, we have one that's set here. There's our keyframe. We can click on it. If we go ahead and right click on that, what we're going to see inside of here is our temporal interpolation. So time-based, what's happening with that. And we're going to see down here is ease in and ease out. Again, we want to go ahead and ease out of our station. So we're going to go ahead and select that one. And then if we come over here and we select our last one and we go ahead and do temporal, and we're going to ease into our station, you'll see that there's a change in the curve now. And that's because what's going to happen with it's going to ramp up its motion, and then it's going to stay steady for a period, and then it's going to actually slow itself back down as it comes back into that station. Now, if we want to go through and we want to work with multiples, if I come over here to flare brightness and I click on the word flare brightness, you'll see that out here inside of it, it's going to go ahead and highlight both of my keyframes. If you go ahead and right click on that, you're going to see then other options that are available to us up here. Now we could go in and we could ultimately select these. So linear, you'll notice if you look at the line there, remember that's this one right here, you'll see that it's going consistent as we go through and start to work with it. What happens when we go to a Bezier? We can see there's a change in the icons. We can also see there's then becomes change inside of this. It does allow us to go in once we set that up. If we're on linear, you see we don't have our handles on there. But if we go ahead, we can adjust these. So there's our velocity. Now if I start to change these, by grabbing a hold of these handles, we're going to see a shift in what's happening with the brightness. How long does it take to transition? What do we have control over? So we can push as to how this is going to go in and be adjusted. Now if we go ahead and we take this and play it, there's a different. If you watch how the lens flare dots begin to move across there, they don't move consistently. It's not just a steady climb. You'll see it speeds up and then it slows itself back down. So you can control that with those handles and do as much to them as you want to do. So feel free to play with those at the beginning. You're probably going to find that you go through and just select ease in or ease out. And then later on, the more and more that you work with it, you may go in there and play with those. I still don't do a whole lot of shifting of the handles to create changes with them. Let's jump into the 07 presets. Now inside of here, we are able to go in and maybe we're trying to do certain tasks. Ultimately, what's going to happen though as we go in and begin to use them is that you're probably going to go in and define your own presets. And that's when you're really going to get a lot more power with it. Also, you're going to start to do stuff that's creative for you, as a style that you work, a method that you like to work. But the main thing that we go in and we start to look at is, in this case, how do we go through and use one effect and then keyframes into an animation so that we can use stuff over and over again. If you go in and you start working for an organization that does certain things over and over again, you're going to have presets. You're going to have a lot of presets that are set in there that you grab the videos, you grab the object, you drop them on there, and it does exactly what you want it to do. Explosions, things along those lines are all going to be set. So let's go into our presets. And what we see on here is we have this initial clip that goes through. We see that we start out in this slow motion. It's looking at the background that's there. He's going to come in. She's going to come in. They have this interaction. And ultimately going to then wander off the screen. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and look at what can we add inside of here. So let's go ahead and jump back over to our effects. And inside of here, we actually want to go into our video effects. Let's go ahead and toggle those open. And we have the one set up top on our presets. I don't want to get into my video effects presets. And we'll see inside of here what's in here. For bevel edges, we have mosaics, PIPs, so it should be picture in pictures, solarize, and also then we have in here our twirl. So let's jump into our solarize and see we have solarize in and solarize out. Let's grab our solarize in, let's bring it out, and let's go ahead and let's drop it onto this. Now, when I go in and I apply it, it's applied to our clip. So depending on where you're at in the clip, you may see something different. Because if I'm towards the end, we're not going to see the action. As soon as I get back to the home part, we're going to see what is here. So if we play this, you can see that solarize is added to add interest to the clip. And it's at the very beginning of what is there. Now we can control this though. So if we go ahead and we select our clip, we're going to see inside of our effects controls are the ability to go in and make adjustments to them. If we go in and we look at this, you're going to see that the effect happens very quickly. There's our two keyframes that are there. If I were to drag this playhead back, you'll see we're in there, but we go from the very beginning. So at zeros until it's out at about 20 frames. So it's actually at the 1 second mark. I think this is a 24 frame per second image. So as we go through and we start to look at, that's what we have available to us. Well, we want to go ahead and adjust that. So they are close together at this time. Well, we can go ahead and we can extend that out if we want to. So at the very beginning here, we can grab a hold of this keyframe. I can grab a hold of that keyframe and I can just move it over. So we can decide how long do we want this to take to go through and begin to process. Now it's really up to you as to how far you want to adjust that. So here I bring it out. I mean, if I bring it out here at 15 seconds is half of it. Well, that's going to be obviously way too long, but if we play it, you'll see Solarize is on there, and it's slowly going to begin to fade itself away. And then eventually it'll be gone. So with that, we've added a preset. We created a preset. It has keyframes in there that goes from Solarize. So it's Solarize in, which tells us it's at the beginning. There's Solarize out, which will tell us it goes to Solarize at the end. But it writes those keyframes for us. It does allow us, though, to simply come in here and we can make an adjustment to how much do we want them to actually go through and work. So at this point, that's the 304 mark. So we can adjust what's going to happen with where is this keyframe. So I can drop it there. And now we can see a much gentler move into what we have. And we can also control that. We can go and we can start to ease the points so it doesn't happen so quickly, so it doesn't have that linear effect to it. But continue to play with what's on there. And we can use additional presets in here as well. So if we came in and grabbed something else and dropped it in, we could do that as well on that. So there are a lot of them that we can actually go through and we can choose from. But the other thing with it is you can also go in and ultimately make your own. So to do that, we're going to jump over to the 08 creating presets. And it says 2 clips. You'll notice that we still have a master clip down there. We see that with the red line underneath of the badge that is there. So what we have is these both have adjustment layers. We'll see that on video 2. And then we have the title, which is on video 3. So we have Laura in the snow there. We come over here, same thing. So we have 2 different clips, but we still have that adjustment layer that is on there. So as we go through and look at it, this is an opening animation, simple sequence. Everything in here is editable, so we start dealing with the standpoint that we have text. So we have our text that's there, text that's here as well. Those are things that are currently set in it. There's our text up there. Toggle that open. Where's the source text controls? So we see this still have the ability to go in and work with what is there. But we want to go ahead and come in here and add some effects to these items. Let's go over to our effects controls. And we start to see what's happening with it. So we have two different clips here. And we have our first one that we want to go in here and be able to use. So let's go ahead and what we're going to do is we're going to put a fast blur effect, and we're going to use what's here to select all 3 of the effects that are inside of here. So let's select the Laura in the Snow. This is the first instance of it. It's the title clip. It's on track 3. And this is where you can see that there is a fast blur up there. So as we go, we start to look at what's applied to it. We see at the very top here, there's one called vector motion. So we're going to go ahead and we want to select what we have up here for our vector motion. So we're selecting the heading. And then we want to go ahead and hold down Command while we click on fast blur. And then we're going to come down, we're going to click on opacity. So we're selecting these 3 because if we go through and start to look at it, you can see at the very top with vector motion, if you look out there, we're going to see keyframes in there. If you move down and you look at the one for fast blur, you're going to see that we also have keyframes out there that have been given an ease function to it. And if you look down at opacity, you'll see keyframes on there as well. So with that, we're going to go ahead and select those. Those are the ones that are important to select because those are the ones that have the changes on it. Those are the changes we actually want to copy, we want to save, that we're going to put into ourselves as a preset. So once we have all 3 of those selected, we can right-click on any of them, and you'll see we have Save Preset on here. Once you select that, you're going to get the Save Preset dialog box that's available to us. Now inside of here, you're going to see that there are 3 different options on here. So we have the ability to scale, anchor to endpoint, or anchor to outpoint. So when we go through and we start to select this, if we look at it from a scale standpoint, it's going to look at the original preset keyframes. And then based upon those and the duration that we have of the clip versus the duration then of the one that's in the sequence, so the original versus the one that's in the sequence, and it will go ahead and automatically then take those and work with those based upon what's in there. If we do anchor to endpoint, that's going to go ahead and preserve the position of that first keyframe in relation to where it's actually coming in. So that'll be at the start. So if you think about the solarize in, of course, played it to the beginning based upon that's the way it was created. If we do anchor to out point, it's going to go to the end part of it. So it's going to preserve them based upon then the end keyframe and work its way back towards the beginning of the clip. So as you choose those, it is important to know which way you want to go ahead and work with this. So we're going to call this title blurs into view. So since we're talking about it blurring into view, we're going to go ahead and we're going to anchor this to the endpoint because, of course, we're focused on this being at the beginning, so the early stuff is what matters. It's the actions that start right away with it. So when we go through and choose that, it's actually going to be matching up with that start of the clip. So any place that we added, it's going to go into there. So once we have that set, we're going to go ahead and come down here, and if you want to, we can go ahead and name it something else. If you didn't want to, talk about it for title blurs into view as we're bringing it in, maybe we go ahead and we take that, and that becomes a description, and we can go ahead and just call this either title intro, title animation, and then we can put a description in there. It depends on how you work. For me, a lot of my names actually tell me exactly what it's doing, so that I don't have to sit there and try to break down what's happening with it, because we could be title animating in, title animating out. So for me, I would just say title blurs into view. Probably would be the name of it versus giving it the name title animation. And we'll go ahead and we'll say OK. So now if we go ahead and we look at what happens with it as it comes in, so there's it coming in, boom, we jump to the next one. Well, we want to apply those same effects to this one. So instead of us going in and having to simply take them and create something from scratch, what we need to do is we're just going to go ahead and grab a hold of the one at the top of our presets. We'll see over here, title animation. And I'm simply going to grab that, and I'm going to bring it out here and drop it on this other one with Laura in the snow. When we go through and do that, you'll see if we were to play it, it has the same effect. If you look up inside of your effects controls, you're going to see that those keyframes are in the same locations. So if you go through and you start to work with stuff, and you know that you have things doing certain things, you're applying effects to stuff, know that you can go through and you can copy them. You'll find this ability to preset and everything inside of other applications as well. So if you're working in After Effects and doing stuff in After Effects, you can do it in there. So most of them that allow you to do presets will actually allow you to copy presets for keyframes as well. So after that, if we start looking at what else is available to us, or what are some other things that you may frequently use inside of here. Let's go ahead and let's jump into our 09 warp stabilizer. Now what's going to happen as you start working with videos is camera's going to move. It's just inherent, camera's going to move. You can get the best tripod, and realistically if you look at it close enough, you're going to see there's a little bit of vibration, especially if there's any wind blowing at all when you're trying to shoot it. And that's where warp stabilizer can come in and actually be very handy to remove that little bit of jitter that is there. Because again, the old cameras were super heavy. The new cameras, super light. The standpoint that holding onto one freehand for a long period of time isn't that bad anymore. So let's go in and let's take a look at it. So if we look at this first shot, you'll see how there's a little bit of sway that we have dealing with the camera. It's not a lot. It's just what's going to happen if you're standing on a boat trying to shoot some video. You're going to have movement that's going to occur in it. Well, what can we do to go in and fix that? Well, we can ultimately go in and use the warp stabilizer effect to work on this. So we're just going to come in here, and I'm going to go into the input box, and I'm just going to start typing in warp. And you'll see here underneath video effects distort, we have this warp stabilizer. And what I'm going to do is I want to go ahead and I'm going to bring that out here. I'm going to drop that on that first clip. Now, as soon as you do that, it's going to see you're analyzing the background. It's going to pop up. That's because it's going in there. It's working. It's looking at the video. It's essentially playing it from the beginning, looking at pixels, colors, everything, and going to go through and work to align what is there. Now, once it goes through and it completes, you're going to see it jumps to a position. And then you're also going to see inside of your effects controls, we have this warp stabilizer. We see the stabilization. So smooth motion, how smooth, how is it going through and work with methods? Are we preserving scale? You'll see in here for borders, for framing, stabilize, crop, and auto scale. That's going to go through and allow it to essentially adjust what's there. So it's adjusted our scale. You can have a maximum and a minimum scale as we go through and we start to work with that. And what's going to happen with this is it's going to go through and it's looking at everything inside of here. So I can toggle that back up if I wanted to and not see what's there. But if I look at what happened to it when I go back to home and I play it. You can go through and you can see how exactly does it go through. So on smooth motion, what's happening with the smooth motion is you'll see there's still a little bit of camera movement. It's not going to go in there and take out all of the camera movement at this point. What happens if we come in and we look at the stabilization method and we say no motion? Well, if we go in here and we set it to no motion, it's going to go back through, it's going to analyze it once again. And if you play it, now what's happening with it is you look at kind of the distortion that starts to appear inside of it. That's because it's still trying to keep certain pieces from moving. So as we go through to begin to work with it, you're going to notice that depending on what's happening, no motion may work very well. But in this case, no motion gives you a bit of a different look and to me, an unrealistic look. So you'd want to take it back in and run it on smooth motion. So depending on what's happening with it, you'll find to get the edge of, yes, I want to use that. No, I don't want to use that. We get down here to our methods. You can see there's 4 different methods that are available to us. So as we start to get into them, out of this, we'll see that perspective and subspace warp are the 2 that are probably the most powerful inside of here. And they do a lot more processing as it goes through and starts to look at it. But if we go through and start to use these and all of a sudden you get way too much distortion, then at that point, you're probably going to want to go in and use position or position, scale, and rotation. So position, scale, and rotation will adjust positioning. It'll automatically be scaling it and dealing with the rotation standpoint of it. The warp side of it, if you kind of think of it from dealing with it on a mesh, it's going to go through and it kind of creates a mesh through there as it goes and adjusts the points. You can look at what happens with each one. So if I went position, scale, rotation, and let it run through with smooth motion, how does that look compared to the other? It may work just fine. The other thing too is as you go through to adjust that, you can also go through and look at what happens with no motion. And then see what's happening with all of the different controls that are happening inside of there. So as you work with it, it is going to get to a point to where you're going to play. And I don't use any other word than play to see what gives you exactly the look that you want to have with it. And then as we go through and we start to look at the smoothness with this, it's going to look at the camera, how much of the original camera movement should actually be retained. At this, it's going to default out to 50%. So you could actually choose to keep it at 50. You could go with, you want less movement. Remember, no movement is essentially 0. So less movement on it so we can start to see what do we have. You know, if we take this up to 75%. So it's going to retain 75% of the movement. And that's just because as you go through and you start to shoot stuff, you might sit there and say, well, I would expect there to be a little bit of camera movement for the realistic feeling of it. So you may want to retain that. You have control of it. Really, it's really getting to the point of experimentation. There's nothing other than that to really start to look at what happens with that. If we look at the second clip. So with this is something that hopefully we don't see anymore this year. But we go through and we start to look at the snow falling inside of here. This shot, since we're really looking at it, this one we want to actually be still. So if you start to look at it, you can see there's just a slight movement. We want this to appear, though, as though there is no motion at all. Static, set on something. The boat, yeah, moving on a boat, you're gonna expect there to be motion. Something that's like this, we want this to have nothing set to it. So we're gonna grab a hold of this. Let's go ahead and let's drop our warp stabilizer onto this clip. And we're gonna go ahead and once it goes through and finishes up, we're gonna go ahead and change that to no motion. And then what you're gonna see on this one now is that you now have nothing moving. So that line that's there that came through, it used to be floating with the camera, is now gone. So as you go through and start to shoot the things, if you're shooting something that's supposed to be still, we're expecting it to be a still shot, then go ahead and set that as a still shot. Go ahead and remove all of the motion from it. Depending on the length of the clip, depending on the size of the clip, the resolution and stuff like that, as you go to stabilize it, it may take longer than others. If you have an older machine, you're going to run into the same situation where you may find that it doesn't go through and stabilize as quickly as these machines do. So it's all going to be machine dependent, processor dependent, even into how much RAM you have available as well. The last one let's jump into here is the clip number 10. So when we go through and we start to look at stuff, we can actually apply clip name effects to them, and it'll automatically generate what the clip name is. So if you're trying to share it with somebody, get feedback with somebody, this is a way that we can add it in there so that as people look at it, they'll know exactly what clip it is. So if they try to talk to you, you'll know what it is that you're using. So we open up this one called clip names. What we're gonna do is we're gonna go ahead and come down here to the new, and with this, we're actually going to put an adjustment layer on here so that we can actually have it go through and begin to work with. And ultimately what it's going to do is it's going to be generating the names on there so that as we go through and play it, we're going to see the name of that individual layer. So let's go ahead and we're going to create an adjustment layer. You'll see at this time, this is a 1920 by 1080. Some of the other ones we've been working with are 720. So again, processing length as we go through to start to work with things can be important that we go through and have. So we have our new adjustment layer that's on here. Right now it's just called adjustment layer. So if I wanted to, I can come out here. I'm going to drop this out here on my track 2, and I'm going to go ahead and drag that all the way out so that way it takes up the entire line. So as we go through and begin to use it, like I said, we can drag that out. The other thing too is if we go through and we start to work with my clip, we can go ahead and depending on where you put this in, could we use the other adjustment layer that's over there? We can bring out any adjustment layers. We're going to drag that over to the right. So we can go through and use it. Another effect on here is if we go ahead and we have this set, and it's not one that I use, but if we jump to the end here, we can actually take that, and if you just go ahead and select that right edge, you can go ahead and hit E, it's going to jump all the way out. So it's just going to move that edge all the way out. It's a step that's there. I still drag it out. And it's a method that I use mainly because you can do that regardless of where the playhead is. Otherwise, you're going to move the playhead, then you're going to drag that out. Or put the playhead, then go back, select it, E. For me, I'm just going to drag it because I know where I'm going to with it. Now remember, we can go through and we can add most visual effects to an adjustment layer. So with that, as we go in and begin to work with them, don't be afraid to start using them. It's also another way you can go ahead and you can play with what is happening with them. So let's go in, and what we want to do is we want to go ahead and add ourselves an adjustment to this. Now there are other ones we can add. Like I said, we've worked before with them. So if I were to come in here and type flip, we can actually do a horizontal flip on an adjustment layer. Now what's going to happen with that? You know, it does allow us to go in and apply an effect to it. Now right now we've gone in and we've applied, in this case, a horizontal flip to it. But just because we've applied something doesn't mean that there's anything in here that has been a change or adjustment to what is here. So we want to go ahead and add in ourselves a clip name. So let's jump back into our effects. And if you start to type in here, you're going to see clip name. Now, clip name is going to come up underneath of our obsolete area. So we're just going to go ahead and take this. We're going to drag this out here. And what it is, we want to go ahead and drop it on this adjustment layer. So when we go through and we put it out here, what we're going to see is by default, as we go through and we add this effect to it, it's only going to show up based upon the actual name of the layer that we actually put it to. So how useful is it for us to come out here and see it as adjustment layer? Well, it's not that useful. I mean, we don't need to say adjustment layer all the way through here because that's what's going to happen as we move this through here. So you'll see we start moving this around here. All of a sudden what we have is that we're looking at just adjustment layer, adjustment layer, adjustment layer. Well, what can we go through and do with this? Well, if we come up and we start to look at it from a standpoint of what's happening with these other effects. So what we're going to do is we're going to come down here and we have what we have for our video 1. So down here with our video 1, we want to go ahead and we want to start to deal with what is it that we're seeing? What are we looking at? What do we want to display with that? So if we come up here into our effects controls, we see up here that we have our clip name that's available to us. So what we want to do is we want to get in here. I'm just going to not seeing the same setup. Like I said, this one is in our obsolete. Let's come down here to our source track. Just gotta figure out what. And we're going to set our source track down here to video 1. Increase our size a little bit on here. And then what you should get then will be your stuff from video 1. Watch once you get into the crossfades, because once it hits a transition, notice it disappears. So for me, when I had this set down here and it wasn't giving me what I was expecting to see, that was because I happened to be over my transition. So that allows us to go in here and allows us to select what is there. So in this case, if we have different tracks or you want them to be paying attention to different things or what key factors are inside of our source track, we can go ahead and adjust that one as well. Now, as you go through and you start to work with things, there are other items that are available inside of here for specific cameras and that you may end up using. So what you'll find, we looked before inside of here and we got into some of the other presets that are available to us. You can look at these, become familiar with what's inside of it. We get into video effects. You know, what's happening with these. If there's a certain camera you're using, you can come in, you can start to select those. So when we get into presets, there's a lens distortion removals. If you're using, for example, a drone, so maybe you're using a DJI Phantom. Well, as you go through and use it, these are things that are happening to it. We can actually apply that to it and it will automatically fix the lens distortion that's inside of there. If you're using other cameras, we looked a little bit at, you look at some of the GoPros. So here's the Hero. So if you're using a Hero 3 Black and you're working with the medium, you can actually fix the lens distortion on here by simply bringing it in there and dragging and dropping that preset on it. So for those of you that might be using other cameras, know that that's available inside of here. Now as we go through and we start to work with it, we do have various sequences that are inside of here. We can come in and select multiple sequences. So if we had things that we wanted to go in and work with, we could select all of them inside of here that we want to go through and work with. And then if we jump back up here to our sequence, you'll see here we can go through and we can ultimately render the effects. So if we go ahead and select that, you're going to see it's going to go through each of the videos that are down there, each of the sequences. And it's going to go in and ultimately render those sequences out so that it will allow us to go in and ultimately work with what is here. So it allows us to go through and it'll play any of the items that are in there. So as you start to work with items, you don't necessarily have to go through and deal with them one by one, but will allow us to go through and render everything that is in there, and then ultimately we can generate or export out the media that is here. So that's working with and applying visual effects. As I said, as you start to work with them, play with them, toy with them, don't be afraid to experiment.